Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to be going over my Rakiata's Dance Blade Trap of Greatswords build I made in solo self-found Affliction League. Now, I originally built this as sort of a meme since I got a hold of the Rakiata's Dance sword, which is a very, very rare unique, and I got it in SSF. So I am using the transfigured blade trap of Greatswords Gem, which throws a trap swinging 2 copies of your equipped two-handed sword around in circles for a duration, and it repeatedly damages enemies. So I built this with as much AoE as possible. I just threw a single one down here, and when it goes off, this is what happens. I expand the AoE as much as possible. Now, before I go over all of the gems, gear, passive tree, and everything, I'm going to throw a map in so you can see how this works. This map has Enfeeble on it, so it's going to lower my damage a bit, and bosses have increased life. Now, in the upcoming league, Blade Trap of Greatswords is getting increased effectiveness of added damage, so this is actually being buffed. And I've removed my charms since the Wildwood Ascendancies are going away. I removed my Steel Skin left click, and I'm just going to hold down spacebar so that still works. So here's enemies. I throw the trap and it will hit enemies. The AoE that it hits is just slightly bigger than the red ring, but not quite as to the extent that the sword reaches. But since the AoE on it is so large, it will destroy tons of stuff. Here's a really big pack, and this one didn't crit. So the biggest issue with this is that when you throw it, it calculates the damage and what it's going to do for every tick of damage that it does. So if it doesn't crit and has low roll damage, its entire duration, it's not going to do as well. So I try and keep my flask up. I'm using Rakiata's boots, so I technically have power charges even though they're not visible, but it can kind of just cut through maps. It does really well, like doing T16 maps. And I also have Spectral Helix that I'm using. This was just to add something else into the gem sockets. I needed an attack to be able to apply Assassin's Mark to rare enemies like this one here. I needed an attack. A Spectral Throw would work, but I can still just kill things with my 4-linked Spectral Helix using this, because the damage is pretty insane when you are using the Rakiata's Dance sword. But for the real damage, it's all in the Blade Trap of Greatswords, and it is pretty obnoxious. As I intended, I'm using a Carcass Jack to scale the AoE as much as I can to make it as big as possible. And yeah, it's kind of like a light show, and this massive sword, it's really hilarious using it on here. And in almost all cases, it only takes one trap, and that'll take out the enemies, and it'll sit there on that spot for quite a while. But for single target, I can not just throw one, but throw up to 4. I have bear traps to cause increased damage taken from traps, and yeah, they're just dead. Pretty easy. Now at the end of the video, I will show a Eater of Worlds probably, but let's go over the gear. Rakiata's Dance is a T0 unique that adds a bunch of flat, cold, and lightning damage with some extra attack speed. And the unique thing about this sword is that it treats enemy monster elemental resistance values as inverted. So the higher resistance to cold and lightning that the enemies have, the more damage I'm going to do to them. And as such, I don't want to lower the resistances on enemies. Now, it can also be rolled on maps that you can give monsters increased elemental resistances. This substantially increases the damage this build can do. So you can roll maps using this sword to give yourself more damage. So it is a very unique piece here. And then, like I mentioned, I'm using a Carcass Jack. This is giving me a lot of increased area of effect. I'm using Rakiata's Impatience to count as having maximum number of Endurance, Frenzy, and Power charges, though this is getting nerfed to remove the 30% movement speed in the coming league. So you can see it here, my crit chance is 69.79%, and that is because I have my power charges. If I remove these boots, it drops to 50.3 because this is factoring in that I'm at max power charges. Now, Blade Trap of Greatswords has an attack tag on it. It's not just scaling through trap damage. So I'm using the Tamings, which give increased elemental damage with attack skills, increased elemental damage, and increased damage with hits and ailments per freeze, shock, or ignite on enemy. So I'm doing a lot of cold and lightning damage, but any source of fire damage will add an ignite to an enemy to give me another 20% increased damage here. And this gives a chance to freeze, shock, and ignite, even though I'm doing lots of crits and I'm using 2 of these, also giving me a lot of elemental resistances on top. So the amount of damage coming out of these taming rings is pretty massive. The last unique piece that I'm wearing is an All's Uprising that allowed me to add Grace into the build for free, thus allowing me to add in Wrath, which gives a bunch more flat lightning damage to attacks. Then I'm using a Blizzard Crown, which adds flat cold damage, and your hits treat cold resistance as 10% higher than the actual value, which is really good for this build because the higher cold resistance, since I'm inverting it, the more damage I'm able to do. So while this is normally a nerf to cold damage slightly with the cold res being higher to this build, it's actually an increase in damage. And here I have a bunch of life and resistances, some fizz taken as fire. My gloves also have resistances. I have a bit of cold damage leeches life, more flat lightning damage to attacks. Belt has a lot of strength on it, which I ended up needing, has a lot of life, and most importantly, it has increased cooldown recovery rate that I got on here using a Veiled Chaos Sword, but that is also changing to not just be able to chaos spam essentially until you hit the cooldown recovery rate, but increasing cooldown recovery rate allows me to throw my blade traps more often. The cooldown time is dropped to 2.95 seconds, so every 3 seconds I can throw one of these down, and I have 4 uses of it, and yeah, that amounts to quite a lot of these blade traps. On my Abyss Jewel in my belt, I have flat fire damage to attacks. You need some source of flat fire damage given the setup to get the extra 20% damage for an ignite being on an enemy. Now the ignite's not going to do a lot of damage since there's a very small amount of fire damage. It will get there and thus increase the amount of damage that you're doing with your lightning and cold damage as well. Now for the gym links, I have my Blade Trap of Greatswords linked with increased critical strike support, giving it an extra base crit chance. It uses the crit chance on the sword. So I've also enchanted this with extra crit chance per quality to raise the base crit chance, and using the critical strikes gem to also help that and push the crit chance higher. Inspiration is reducing the mana cost of skills and also increases crit chance and does more elemental damage per inspiration charge. Advanced Traps substantially lowers the cooldown recovery rate for traps, 107% increased cooldown recovery rate at gym level 20, and gives you increased trap throwing speed. Trap and mind damage support gives more trap and mind damage. And lastly, I have an awakened elemental damage with attacks for up to 40% more elemental damage at a level 6. And my Spectral Helix, I never qualied it. I never relied on this to do damage. This is really just to be able to apply a mark and just add some more of these flying giant swords around. Any attack could do. You could use Frenzy to run up and hit an enemy. You could use Spectral Throw so you have more target to an enemy, but once you get like an echoing shrine or something, all these extra swords flying around, it gets pretty wild. So I also have this linked with inspiration. So I can build up my inspiration charges without having to throw down 5 blade traps of greatswords. So that only gives me 1 when I just threw the 1 trap. And since that's a cooldown, that's a little bit harder to get the inspiration charges. But if I just use Spectral Helix a bunch of times, I get those inspiration charges, and inspiration charges will work across them since they're both linked with the support gem. Also here I have faster attacks and slower projectiles. Slower projectiles will mean that these will last longer before they get to their end duration, and faster attacks means I can throw more of them down, because this was just kind of for the memes. In my chest I have Bear Trap. This causes enemies to take 25% increased damage from trap or mine hits. So that's a pretty big buff. The base duration of it is 3 seconds. And then with all the increased duration I push that up to 4.78 seconds. You can put an increased duration support gem in there with that to make it longer, but I could throw that down and it's going to make enemies take a lot more damage from the blade trap of Greatsword madness that happens. Also, here's the mark on hit with an assassin's mark. You actually have to hit an enemy with an attack yourself. Hitting an enemy with the blade trap will not apply the assassin's mark. So that is another reason I put this extra attack in here. And I don't have a leap slam or anything other kind of attack. It's really just the Spectral Helix. And also in here is my Grace that is being granted for free because of the All's Uprising I'm using. In my helmet, I have Summon Skitterbots, which grants more trap and mine damage. Also chilling and shocking enemies near it, which with my rings, I mean, I guess only the shock would guarantee that I'm getting that extra damage there. I have a level 17 clarity and a Wrath gem. Now, I originally wasn't using the Wrath gem. I added this in after I got the All's Uprising, since I was able to get the Grace for free. It ended up proving that Wrath was more effective for extra damage than was a Hatred, since I'm stacking both lightning and cold damage. The flat lightning damage just appeared to be better, and it's going to be even better next league because the effectiveness of added damage is going up. I have a Cast on Death portal, though this build proved to be pretty tanky and get through maps pretty nicely. I only have just over 4k life, but I very easily leveled to 97 on this build. Nearby enemies are blinded. You take reduced damage from blinded enemies. You have a bunch of evasion with the Grace, and then blinded enemies have less accuracy, so you wind up having a lot of evasion. I didn't really invest too much into evasion rating, so it's only a 66% chance, 15,902, but being able to blind enemies helps push that to another level. In my boots, I have a Frost Blink. This is my movement skill of choice. I really like Frost Blink. You get big areas of chilled ground. Now, something you could do with this is add a Bone Chill linked to it, so you could put chilled ground down and scale the effect of chill in this chilled ground, and thus increasing the cold damage enemies take while they're chilled by that skill. But I have several sources of chill. I didn't end up going with that. I have Precision, which is increasing my accuracy and also giving me extra crit chance. Now, Blade Trap of Greatswords is technically an attack. Here in the character sheet, it actually has a chance to hit. You have to have accuracy to hit with the Blade Trap. So it doesn't work like a lot of other trap skills. You actually need the accuracy there. So Precision also gives crit chance, and that works nicely. Then I have a Steel Skin, a nice defensive buff, and an Enduring Cry to use as an extra life regeneration tool, and buff my endurance charges that I have, even though they're not shown from the Relicash boots. For flasks, I have a Quicksilver Flask with extra movement speed, reduced charges used, a Granite Flask that increases my evasion rating, but I want that bit of extra armor, so if I do get hit, I'm not taking as much damage. A Phasing Flask with a chance to avoid being stunned, since I don't have the largest amount of life. this chance to avoid being stunned ends up helping a lot were I to get hit. And then a diamond flask with additional crit chance. So 69 crit chance with all my flasks up, that's 78.9. And then the assassin's mark on the enemy will push it up to a 96.04 crit chance. And then I have a life flask to remove bleed and corrupting blood when I press that. For my Pantheon, I cannot be stunned if I've been stunned in the past 2 seconds, so I can't get chain stunned. I avoid freezes, reduced effect of chill, and then I'm using Abarath for less duration of ignites and unaffected by burning ground. So jumping into the Ascendancy here. The most important thing on here is probably like clockwork, as this gives you increased cooldown recovery rate, and also nearby enemies have reduced cooldown recovery rates. So enemies that have big cooldowns on certain abilities won't be able to use those abilities as often, including in boss fights. So that's pretty cool, but you need as much cooldown recovery rate as possible so that you can put down the most blade traps as possible. Also in here is chain reaction. When your traps trigger, your nearby traps also trigger, but skills used by traps have 50% increased area of effect. There's extra area of effect on the small nodes here as well, including the one down here on the way to like clockwork. And then Pyromaniac gives immunity to ignite and shock, and you regenerate 2% of life per second for each trap triggered in the past 4 seconds, up to 10%. So this is a nice source of life recovery for the build. And lastly in here is more increased area effect with increased blind effect, and then you cannot be blinded. You take reduced damage from blinded enemies. Nearby enemies are blinded and you blind enemies on hit. So that lowers their accuracy and evasion rating, making them easier to hit. And then you take that reduced damage from them. So my 4k life doesn't look quite as bad at that point. Now, to maximize damage, you probably wouldn't use Born in the Shadows. You could use Explosives Expert. And since I'm shocking, chilling, and igniting enemies, you would gain this 10% Ellie pin, the 80% crit chance, and the 40% crit multi by using that instead. But I went with the safety route with Born in the Shadows. Now, my passive tree kind of has some weird things going on with it. As you get things in SSF, you try and find ways to use them, and I'll explain what's going on with the jewels when I get there. But I pathed out through the start here, increasing elemental damage, giving some energy shield here, getting to trickery, which has damage and crit chance, pathing through the crit chance and multi to cold-hearted calculation for some mana regen, extra damage, and I probably need that int. I sure do. Pat down through Blood Siphon for some life, Dex Inch with coordination. I don't think attack speed really matters when it comes to the trap, but it is nice to have. And then pathing down to this crossroads here, I'm coming in and getting Charisma for mana reservation efficiency, getting increased aura effect from my skills. And since I'm using 5 different auras, that works quite well with my Grace giving me evasion, get extra flat lightning damage, increase the buff from skitterbots, get extra accuracy from precision, and extra mana regen from the clarity. And this jewel to the left here, I'm using an impossible escape that allocates Wind Dancer here. Allows me to allocate any passives in its radius, so then I didn't have to path down here to get the 10% Ellie penetration from Forces of Nature. Elemental penetration will not lower enemies' resistances, it just treats it as lower. And since I'm inverting the resistances, it's making positive res negative, and then elemental penetration beyond that just pushes their resistance down lower. So in this radius of Wind Dancer, I'm also getting the attack damage and crit chance for attacks from Aspect of the Links, also giving me some movement speed. grabbing Revenge of the Hunted for spell suppression while on full life, max life and evasion rating, and getting increased flash charges gained, and my life flask gain charges every 3 seconds. That works for mana flasks as well, were I to use one, but I instead opted to use Clarity because I have an Enlighten linked with my aura skills in my helmet. And I only managed to get a level 3 Enlighten, so this is the limit I could push my mana reservation to. But pushing further on to the left, I come down through reflexes. There is a possibility for an evasion mastery here if you wanted it, but I grab Mage Bane for extra spell suppression. But the big reason to push over into here is not necessarily for the life, which there is a bunch of that in Constitution and Profane Chemistry, but to get exceptional performance, giving increased skill effect duration and a mastery for more skill effect duration. This causes my traps to last longer when I throw them. I've got the damage buffed up to 6.38 seconds once it triggers. So since I'm pathing down here, I get the spell suppression and I grab a bunch of life here. I get a little bit of all res from Sentinel. Pushing to the right, I ended up needing this intelligence and the strength. So I grabbed those there. I'm giving up a lot with the attributes with the amulet and rings using these unique options. So these points wound up being required. But pushing down, I have spell suppression in Inveterate. I also prevent an increased amount of suppressed spell damage. I grab the critical strike chance and crit multi in Heartseeker, get extra crit multi against unique enemies. Grab the jewel socket that has crit multi, trap damage, projectile speed, and life on it. I was playing an SSF, so this isn't a min-max jewel. You could definitely do more with it. And then I grab an extra maximum frenzy charge and get increased evasion rating per frenzy charge here. Further pushing down, I got Fatal Blade. Sword attacks deal increased damage with hits and ailments, but then a bunch of crit chance and multi with swords, and this does affect the blade trap of Greatswords, since it uses my two-handed sword. Get more life with Herbalism, the flat life from the Mastery, more spell suppression and intuition, as well as quick step, extra movement speed here as well. And then one with nature gives crit chance for attacks and elemental damage with attack skills, which Blade Trap of Great Swords is both of those things. So you get the extra elemental damage and crit chance here with some all res as well. Now there is more elemental damage here in Primeval Force for you to want to work that in. There is that, but I didn't end up working that into the build. So pushing up from this intersection here, I have another jewel socket. And in here, I am using an Inspired Learning because I got it in SSF. This definitely is not necessary. It's not helpful against endgame bosses, but I gain one of the mods from rare enemies when I kill it, and this even works when the Blade Trap of Great Swords kills an enemy. So 4 notable passives within the radius of this gem are required to be allocated for it to work, and I have 5 of them, with the Frenzy Charge, Power Charge, Depth Perception, which gives global accuracy and crit chance, also increasing the accuracy bonus from Dexterity with the Mastery, grabbing Blood Drinker to get more life, and then grabbing Mind Drinker, which gives mana recovery on kill, but I more grab this for the mana reservation efficiency of skills. Now I'm also using the Ghost Dance Keystone, which I cannot recover energy shield to above evasion rating, but I have a lot more evasion rating. But every 2 seconds I gain a Ghost Shroud up to 3, which I have 3 here. And then when I get hit, I lose one of those Ghost Shrouds to recover energy shield equal to 3% of my evasion rating. So my evasion rating without flasks is 15,902, with flasks 19,000. So hitting the calculator here, 15,902 times 0.03 is 477 energy shield gained when I get hit while I have a Ghost Shroud, and I currently have 459 energy shield, so that replenishes all my energy shield every single time I get hit, given that I have a Ghost Shroud from Ghost Dance. Then there's the big trap wheel. There's increased trap damage here, chance for traps to trigger an additional time. This is really valuable, especially when you're using cooldown traps. This is effectively, over time, 10% more damage. And then there's trap trigger area of effect, but on this node, you also get increased area of effect with unstable munitions. Then there's also crit chance in multi with traps, leading to high explosives. Chance to gain a power charge when your trap is triggered by an enemy, but with the Rakiata boots, I count as being on max power charges regardless, so I don't need to generate the power charges. The mastery here is another 8% chance for traps to trigger an additional time, so effectively, like when it goes off, like getting those extra traps, it amounts to 18% more damage because you're getting those additional traps. And the last node's up here, and probably the most important node on the tree for using a cooldown trap, is Over-Prepared. This gives increased cooldown recovery for throwing traps and allows an additional cooldown use. So without this node, I can only have 3 max blade traps of Greatswords, but then I can have 4 if I take Over-Prepared. And then I'm getting extra life and energy shield here, and I don't technically need that 10 strength, but I got a ton of strength on my belt, so there was probably a point where the strength was required. Now there's a lot of other things that you could do with this on the passive tree. These nodes here increase lightning damage with attack skills. Damage with weapons penetrates 8% lightning resistance. Crit chance against enemies with lightning exposure is something you could do, but giving enemies lightning exposure lowers their resistances, so that's probably not something you want to do. But lightning penetration, as I described, is good. Now, you don't need to worry about working up into Whispers of Doom, because if you're using curses like elemental weakness, frostbite, conductivity, all of those lower elemental resistances. So I wound up just using the one mark on this build with Assassin's Mark to help bolster my critical strike chance, as well as getting additional crit multi to the enemy that is marked by Assassin's Mark. The only hex curse that would probably really help at all could be punishment, which causes enemies on low life to take increased damage. That would work to help scale the damage, but it's probably not as valuable as the Assassin's Mark is, considering blade traps of greatswords. When you throw it, it calculates the damage per hit, and then that is the hit that is given for the entire duration of the trap. So you want to make sure that that trap crits when you use it. There's lots of other trap nodes on the tree. Saboteur is increased trap damage. There's increased trap throwing speed here. Elemental focus is elemental damage, increasing the effect of non-damaging ailments, gives you bigger shocks, so that would increase damage as well. There's nodes here for trap trigger area of effect, which I ended up not needing because I had plenty of that. Coming out here and getting Snowforged would lower enemy elemental resistances if they're ignited or chilled by you, and we don't want to lower resistances on enemies, we want to raise them, so I didn't come here for those. You could also come up here, get high voltage, crit chance against shocked enemies, crit multi with lightning skills, but this is not a lightning skill that I'm using. Eldritch Battery could be used to lessen the mana recovery requirement, allowing you to drop clarity from the build, and then use Energy Shield over here. You could work in another aura. There's also more crit multi here with Throat Seeker, Glacial Cage even. Enemies permanently take 1% increased damage for each second they've ever been chilled by you, up to a maximum of 10%. So that you could get increased effective chill there. Let's see what else. There are trap nodes right here to give extra trap damage. And this node gives a chance to gain a frenzy charge when your trap is triggered by an enemy, but again, since I'm using Rakiata's Impatience, I don't need to worry about generating frenzy charges. I'm just technically at my max of 5 all the time, and that gives up to 20% more damage at those 5, so that winds up being a pretty big deal. And then the physical damage reduction from the endurance charges is also really strong. But I don't need to worry about getting charges from maybe something like an overcharge or a master sapper. There's also more crit chance in multi here in true strike, more life on kill with hired killer. There's lots of possibilities there. There's also more accuracy that you could get with acuity, another mastery if desired, but the attack speed's not going to scale the rotation on the traps, so you don't really need the attack speed. Were you to work in a blind mastery, you could get crit chance against blinded enemies, further scale the blind effect by being a saboteur, getting extra evasion rating, something like this wheel here. There's really a lot of ways you could expand on this build in Trade League, and using Blade Traps of Greatswords, you don't really have to use Rakiata's Dance. That's just what I built this build around. And for a large portion of while I was playing this build, I even used a cosmetic microtransaction, a skin transfer to apply the Void Forge MTX to my Rakiata's Dance, so it appeared as though I was using the Void Forge, even though I was using the Rakiata's Dance, and the Void Forge has a really cool effect to it. And then used with the Blade Trap of Greatswords, it looks like this. And I think that wound up looking way cooler than the Rakiata's Dance, and the Rakiata's Dance ends up being pretty bright with that giant glow effect to it. Now, I also, when playing this, went through a lot of different weapon effects. So, for example, with the Heartseeker weapon effect, it just like changes the look of my sword. What that means is that when I use the Blade Trap of Greatswords, it's just going to apply a glow to that sword effect, but something that has a trail on it, like the Malice weapon effect, when I throw down the Blade Traps, it's going to give the red effect swirl to the Blade Traps. But I looked through most sword MTX in the game. There aren't really many that are going to do anything for you outside of just add a glow to a different weapon shape, and there's not going to be much to it. But there is always the hilarity of the gigantic spinning Rakiata's Dance swords that you get with this. It's pretty absurd and amazing, but Path of Exile allows you to do things like that. There's also a bunch of different chests you could use that give you more value than using a carcass jack. Something crafted could give you extra base crit if you're using an elder base, I think. An incandescent heart, for example, could give you elemental as extra chaos damage. Doppelganger guys could give you tons of extra crit chance because this gives you a more crit chance. Or you could use the chest piece to give you extra life and resistances, and then do other things with gloves maybe, or a belt. Though belt is really you really need the cooldown recovery rate there. And I don't know if there's a better helmet base than the Blizzard Crown, raising enemies' cold resistance. So I liked using the Carcass Jack for the extra area effect, making it as big as I really could make it. Now, I thought I was going to do a streaming invitation. I think I'm going to change that because I have Uber Elder fragments. I'm going to go kill Uber Elder with this build instead. Can't craft anything else onto this like I could the invitation. But like I've mentioned, there's a lot more potential that you could get with this, like a 6-mod corrupted jewel. You could probably get something better than this Impossible Escape that I worked in. In Trade League, there's much more potential for this build. And again, it is getting buffed in the coming league. But let's see how I fare against an Uber Elder here. I might have thrown it too early. Let's throw some blade traps down on Shaper. He should be phased. I can start damaging Elder now. I'm using the Spectral Helix to move the mark there. Oops. I let Shaper hit me. Oops. But my damage was pretty solid, and I wasn't holding down my spacebar to get my steel skin because I don't have access to the automation gem support yet. I'll let this thing... Oh, I'm bad at this game. I thought I had a 10-second window here. Oh, I was holding down spacebar, so I got rid of my window there by using a steel skin. So that's good. But there goes those portals with the blade traps. Oh! Shaper Beam just destroying me there. Alright, I gotta step it up and play well now. Not get beamed by Shaper. I don't have lots of extra max res. Okay. Shaper Slam. Good. And he should be phased, so now I can go back to damaging Elder. Dodge that beam. Okay, like the damage is good. Now we're into this ad phase. Hold down my steel skin. You can use my enduring cry to get the extra buff on my endurance charges. Trying to like save my cooldowns for when I can go back to damaging them. It's gonna suck losing the movement speed on the Rakiata. It's not going to be quite as effective, but that should be phased on Shaper. And then let's not die to the slaps from Elder or the beam from Shaper. We're getting Elder Slam. Gotta move out of that. Don't die to Shaper Beam. Need to remove these portals. Be prepared for another beam. There that is. So the point of this was to try and showcase the ability of the skill. Oh, dodge the slam, dodge that slam. Yikes, yikes, yikes. Did I already kill Shaper? I think I might have done it. Like the damage is really solid on this. And I guess like these pinnacle bosses probably have a decent resistance amount. So I might be doing better damage against the pinnacle bosses than I would be other sources that might not have quite the resistance for me to invert, right? And I could roll my invitations for Exarch and Eater to increase their resistances, making them just get absolutely shredded. But we got to see what this Watcher's Eye is. Chance to impale and chance to deal double damage while using Pride, and Chaos Res while using Purity of Elements. And I got myself an Indigon, only 22% spell damage for mana spent. But that is going to do it for this guide. Path of Building is in the video description, but that's going to do it for this one. I'd like to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, definitely hit the like button as it really helps the channel out a lot. Subscribe to make sure you don't miss more videos from me. If you'd like to help support my channel, please consider using super thanks, the heart icon just below the video, or by joining to become a member. And I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.